Hello everyone. Just to let you know, for the first time, the Zodiac Killer News Report will be coming out in 2 parts this week, so thank you for clicking on this link and checking out Part 1, and please look forward to Part 2 in the near future, and those of you who are following along with the playlist, you can just keep on listening. This episode's going to be a little bit shorter, but there will be a Part 2 coming very soon. Alright, let's get started. BBOR Black Box Online Radio. Coming to you from West Virginia, BlackBoxNed88 on Instagram for the bonus podcast. And welcome to BBOR, the home of true crime talk radio and your premier destination for unsolved mysteries, criminal psychology, and exploring the dark side of cyberspace. My name is Ned DeHaan, and I am your host, as well as the creator of AstroPsych 400 here on YouTube, and regular contributor to the Zodiac Killer channel. And a great way to support these shows is just by listening to some more content. But you can also go over to Amazon.com and have a look at the book Killer on a White Horse, written by me, Ned DeHaan. It is a novel, murder mystery, inspired by the Zodiac Manson connection, but it is indeed fictional. However, who doesn't love a good mystery? And there is always the TeeSpring page. Feel free to check out some of the merchandise. And remember, being weird is not a crime. Let the show begin. Okay, hello everybody. Today is Monday, another Zodiac Monday. Welcome to the show. How's everybody doing? First, I would like to give a big thank you to everybody who listened to the recent episode that came out about the Kennedy assassination last Friday for the Anything Goes Friday segment, and you guys were leaving some really good questions and comments in the episodes previously because I did a Q&A session where I responded to them, and a lot of people are giving some good feedback about that. And if you're curious about the Kennedy assassination, I invite you to listen. And I also did a multi-part series in the past on a particular theory involving JFK. It's one that's actually connected to the Israeli Mossad. And if you're curious about these types of true crime discussions, I invite you to hit the like button, subscribe, and feel free to visit some of the links in the description box. Those are very, very good ways to help out the show. And one of the links is for BuyMeACoffee.com, BuyMeACoffee.com/BlackBoxNed88. And this allows you to make a donation or contribution to help the program. And anybody who makes a donation will get a shout out on Zodiac Monday. And of course, you can also go over to the Shorts page here on YouTube for Black Box Online Radio. Yes, the YouTube Shorts. There are several new episodes that came out last week if you're just curious about some other things that are true crime related. And right now, I would like to begin with something about the Zodiac Killer and a different YouTube channel. And it's actually coming to us from the Citizen Detective Podcast, which again, you can listen to here on YouTube for free. And I have to give a shout out to Drew Gray, who recommended it to me once again. And they have a 3-part series out on the Zodiac Killer. I mean, they have at least 3 episodes devoted to the Zodiac specifically, and one of them is talking about the murder of Sherry Jo Bates from 1966, which could have been the first possible Zodiac crime. Now, I had the opportunity to listen to the first episode, and each one of these is about 3 hours long. It also features Mike Morford of ZodiacKiller.net. I almost said ZodiacKillerSite.com. That was his old website. And there is a host of other people that is on the panel discussions, and they were asking a lot of questions, and they're sharing a lot of things about the Zodiac Killer. And I thought that it would be good to respond to this particular set of true crime theories, because they, in 3 hours, right, 3 hours talking about the Zodiac, of course they're going to be saying a bunch of things that you will agree with and a bunch of things that you will disagree with. Now, the first episode that I listened to, and this is episode 20 if you go to the Citizen Detective Podcast on YouTube, was about the Zodiac Killer's first 2 crimes, the Lake Herman Road murders, which took place in December of 1968, and the Blue Rock Springs shooting, which took place on July 4th of 1969. The Lake Herman Road murders saw the deaths of David Faraday and Betty Lou Jensen, and the Blue Rock Springs shooting saw the death of Darlene Ferrin and the shooting of Mike Mageau. Mike Mageau would go on to survive and provide a witness description of the Zodiac. And one of the participants that was featured on the panel was Dr. Lee Meller, and he seems to be very insightful when it comes to discussing true crime cases. He does a lot of what I do here on Black Box Online Radio, comparing and contrasting different true crime stories. But one point that he was introducing about the Lake Herman Road murders is that you have 2 people who were murdered, David Faraday and Betty Lou Jensen, and they're sitting in the front seat of David Faraday's Rambler that is parked on the side of Lake Herman Road, and there were two theories discussed as how the shooting could have taken place. One of them was about how Betty Lou Jensen could have exited the car first, facing the gunman, and that she was actually shot first. And then there's even a story that was shared in the comments section by Drew Gray here on Black Box Online Radio saying that there was a report of a powder burn on Betty Lou Jensen's dress, and she's actually running away from the killer while he is shooting. And then the killer orders David Faraday to come to the other side of the car, and he is shot second. Okay, that's one theory, and I hadn't heard that exact arrangement of the Lake Herman Road murders before. So later on in the discussion on the Citizen Detective podcast, they talked about how there could be another way that the crime took place that people haven't truly examined that thoroughly, and maybe it's been shared in some other discussions. I'm sure at this point it's been shared, but it is that the killer exits the driver's side of his car, whatever type of car that was. This is the Zodiac, mind you, and he is holding up David Faraday and Betty Lou Jensen with a gun. He walks around to the driver's side door because the man is in the driver's seat, the male victim is in the driver's seat. And a key characteristic of the Zodiac killer's behavior is he always wants to go to the male victim first, and he wants to shoot David Faraday. But what they do is Betty Lou Jensen opens the door to the Rambler, and then David Faraday jumps across into the passenger seat and follows her out. So they're exiting the car, and then the killer circles back around, almost making a half circle from the driver's side to the passenger side, shoots David Faraday at roughly point-blank range, and then fires the gun at Betty Lou Jensen as she is running away. So, I mean, both of these, I think, are reasonable things to discuss. I'm not completely certain if either one of those are actually how the crime took place. In the past, I had thought something to the contrary, that they were both just ordered out of the car and told to face the road, and that David Faraday was shot first and Betty Lou Jensen was shot while she was running. But this seems more like David Faraday and Betty Lou Jensen were trying to evade the killer, and this leads to a different set of theories that had been shared also on Citizen Detective, talking about the Blue Rock Springs shooting. Because at the Blue Rock Springs shooting, the killer didn't order the victims out of the car. Darlene Ferrin and Mike Mageau were both shot seated in the car. And Tom Voigt of ZodiacKiller.com even once asked this as a rhetorical question. Well, why did the Zodiac killer shoot David Faraday, the male victim, at point-blank range in the head, when he didn't do that at Blue Rock Springs? He sprayed the victims with bullets, more or less, and the male victim, Mike Mageau, ultimately survived. So why is there this difference? The idea that was postulated on Citizen Detective was that there could have been some type of thought process from the Zodiac where he's thinking, all right, Lake Herman Road almost went completely haywire. I almost lost control of the situation. I'm not going to do anything about approaching the victims in any standoffish or intimidating manner. I'm just going to start firing bullets into the car. And it goes to show one point that they also wanted to reinforce. This person probably had some experience with firearms, but maybe not an extremely intense experience with firearms. Maybe he was even somewhat of a firearms enthusiast, and he read lots of gun magazines, and he owned different firearms, but not someone who was a police officer or somebody who had been using firearms regularly in the military. Maybe he had a different military-style job, which I'll talk about later on in this episode. But those are some of the initial points they talk about in relation to how and why the killer would have approached the car at Lake Herman Road in Blue Rock Springs. Now, the stuff that I found to be absolutely fascinating on the Citizen Detective podcast, of course, relates to the Zodiac killer suspects. And one suspect that was requested from somebody in their chat was Robert Christian Hansen. What do you think about Robert Christian Hansen as a Zodiac killer suspect? And the question was actually, has anybody ever talked about Robert Christian Hansen as a Zodiac killer suspect? Why, certainly, here on Black Box Online Radio. But I will go over this real fast because I've talked about him before. Robert Christian Hansen was a serial killer in Anchorage, Alaska, who was known as the Butcher Baker. And he is someone who wasn't a lifelong Alaskan. He was born in 1939. He grew up in Pocahontas, Iowa, and he had family in California and connections to San Francisco and Southern California. Those were some things that they were discussing about why he should be viewed as a Zodiac killer suspect. But they were asking, when did he leave for Alaska? And this is one that I actually knew the answer to. 1967, so prior to the beginning of Zodiac killer activity. But The reasons why I've never thought highly of Robert Christian Hansen as a Zodiac killer suspect are simple. Number one, he abducted the victims and transported their bodies. Number two, he targeted sex workers. Number three, he handcuffed the sex workers once they were inside his car. Number four, he put them on a plane sometimes. Number five, he killed the victims with a Ruger Mini 14 rifle. None of those things are present in the Zodiac killer's line of work, or the Zodiac killer's method. I mean, if you had the Zodiac killer using a Ruger Mini 14 rifle on his victims, I would be like, yeah, absolutely, this guy's a strong suspect. Even if there was just one victim that had been killed with a Ruger Mini 14 rifle, yeah, that'd be something to think about. Or if the Zodiac killer had targeted sex workers, yeah, then I would say, okay, there might be some type of connection. But you have to understand, it's not as simple as just that Robert Christian Hansen would lure prostitutes in his car. He said that once the woman got into his car, he could slap the handcuff on her like a reflex. He was so just natural at it. And I'm not seeing any of these details in the Zodiac killer mystery. And of course, the response that was provided by a citizen detective was that these are just behavioral profiling observations that purely relate to interpretation, and it's possible that a killer could have evolved into a new type of serial killer after 5 years or 10 years or something to that effect. Not to mention that Robert Christian Hansen appears to resemble some physical descriptions of the Zodiac killer. And another strong point, back when I did the episodes on Robert Christian Hansen, this is perhaps what I think is the strongest point in favor of him having any type of involvement with the Zodiac killer mystery, is that he hunted people for sport. And the Zodiac killer said very clearly in his first cipher that he said, I like killing people because it's so much fun. It's even more fun than killing wild people in the forest, because man is the most dangerous animal of all. Almost certainly a reference to the novel / short story / movie, The Most Dangerous Game. And Robert Christian Hansen was a real serial killer who targeted people and hunted them for sport. Now, I'm a little bit hazy on this exact detail, so please don't even quote me on this, but the story is that he was one of the few serial killers who would transport his victims to a different location. Like, he would abduct these women who were working as sex workers, and he would as I said, handcuff them. He would put them on a plane, like one by one, of course, I mean, one at a time, and he would fly the woman to a secluded area and then release her, and then hunt her down with his Ruger Mini 14 rifle. So he's actually hunting people for sport, a very clear case of somebody who is actually hunting them for sport, and I hope I didn't misstate anything there, but that's how I remember the story of Robert Christian Hansen. But number one, he doesn't seem to have any real connection to the Bay Area in 1968 and 69, because Mike Morford wanted to reinforce one point. Not only would it be flying down to commit these crimes December 20th, 1968, July 4th, 1969, September 27th, 1969, and October 11th of 69, when the crimes were committed. Also, somebody would have had to have been present in the Bay Area to mail the letters, and I just don't think that Robert Christian Hansen was that person. I believe that he was in Alaska, and he was running his bakery. I mean, he was Bob the Baker. That's why they call him the Butcher Baker. It's because he just put on this facade of being this nice, gentle business owner, when in reality he was a murderous serial killer. So that was my immediate response. I mean, they seem to think highly of him as a suspect. I think that he is absolutely on the low end of the spectrum. For all the reasons I've stated, there's the details and the behaviors of Robert Christian Hansen are dealing with some type of sexual motivation that isn't present in the Zodiac killer's crimes, because the Zodiac killer may have had some type of sexual drive to kill, but not targeting sex workers, and also not abducting and transporting the bodies. I think this is just a totally different type of psychological operation going on. But if you want to dispute that with me, you can put your idea in the comment section down below, and please feel free to share anything that you would like. Another suspect in the Zodiac killer mystery that was discussed on this show was Ted Kaczynski, and they were talking about how there's this differentiation between Ted Kaczynski and the Zodiac. Ted Kaczynski, of course, would more famously go on to become the Unabomber, and the statement that they made was that Ted Kaczynski was almost too intellectual to be the Zodiac killer. He was almost somebody who had a type of criticism of society and civilization, and the Zodiac is talking all about himself. He's just saying, I like killing people because it's so much fun. He's just saying, I am too clever and all this. He's just talking about himself. And one person who would absolutely disagree with that is Sphere the Cube, someone whom I corresponded and talked to a lot last year. We did a series on his Zodiac killer suspect, Robert Fulvins, and it's called The Moraga Letters. I highly recommend you check out the episodes Zodiac Killer, New Discovery, The Moraga Letters, the first one in the series. There's also one called The Zodiac Killer Moraga Connection, and that'll give you more of the gist of the theory. But he talked about all of this with the Zodiac Killer mystery. No matter what your suspect is, no matter who your suspect is, not what. I should have said, no matter what your theory is, no matter who your suspect is, what Spheri wanted to point out is that the Zodiac Killer is talking about civilization, and he is also talking about society, because firstly, the Zodiac is making a mockery of law enforcement and the police. The Zodiac is making a mockery of journalists and the media by mailing in these taunting letters, by mailing in the ciphers that people can't solve. And he is also making a mockery of the educational system by adding in all these types of ridiculous misspellings in his letters. And this would go to show that he's just making a mockery of the entirety of society, of the entirety of civilization, even about belief systems, making a mockery of religion when he says, "I will die and be reborn in paradise, and those whom I have killed will be my slaves." So that type of intellectualism is there in the Zodiac Killer's writings, in Spheri's interpretation, but I think it's a pretty good one, and it's one that I mostly agree with. Now, there's also one point that was discussed on the Citizen Detective podcast about the composition of the Zodiac Killer's letters. And yes, they're misspellings, and sometimes they appear to be sloppy, and it was brought up by someone named Alex Ralph that was the Zodiac Killer drunk when he was composing the letters and gaining a type of liquid courage? And I've never really thought about that too much in the past, but somebody asked me a question, and I think it was a joke once. I mean, they asked me a question once, and I think it was a joke, not someone only asked one joking question one time. They asked me a question once, and I think that it was a joke. It was that, do you think the Zodiac Killer wrote his letters in his pajamas? And my answer was, okay, you're probably joking, but I'm going to say no. I think the Zodiac Killer was wearing his work clothes when he was writing the letters, whatever clothes he would have worn to work, because it seems that this person is taking this concept very seriously, and he is trying to put a lot of thought and effort into the planning and composition and the creation of his letters, and I just didn't think that he would have done it in his pajamas. It's possible, though. I mean, it doesn't take too much thought to create something in your mind about how this is somebody who is trying to be relaxed. Okay, and yes, he's drinking beer or wine or whiskey, whatever he would have whatever type of poison was his preference, so to speak. Maybe. I mean, this is an unsolved case. We're evaluating them. But I still stand by the former. I still stand by my original observation. I don't think the Zodiac Killer would have been drunk when he was composing his letters, and definitely not the ciphers. Absolutely not. The ciphers are way too neat, very neatly composed. And if you would like to dispute any of these things, you can put your ideas on the comments section down below. And before we move on to the next segment, I would like to respond to some of the material from the previous Zodiac Mondays, and there is a comment that came in from Midnight Ventures about Zodiac Killer suspect Arthur Lee Allen, and it says, "Arthur Allen sure seemed like he wanted to be the Zodiac, but he sure didn't want the consequences that came along with it, like life in prison. He played mind games with the investigators. I don't think I'd believe a deathbed confession from Allen that he was the Zodiac, considering his antics." Now, this is a very good comment, and possibly Midnight Ventures hit the nail on the head in regards to a deathbed confession that was made from Arthur Lee Allen allegedly to the Seawaters, Dave and Connie Seawater, who have gone somewhat public with their story, and they've been talking about it for years, to be clear, but they had a YouTube channel where they were sharing their story of how they knew Arthur Lee Allen personally and all the points that could have been in favor of his guilt being the Zodiac Killer. One of you guys in the comment section wrote something down below saying that they've taken down most of their videos, so perhaps they're going to be sharing their story in a different media outlet. But the reason why I think there is some value in this comment is, what if Arthur Lee Allen did in fact make a deathbed confession to the Seawaters? What if they are telling the truth, and it's just as simple as he lied? Because when you listen to the videos from the Seawaters, they don't give away any of the telltale signs of lying. They also don't show immediate signs of deception. And I said very clearly, I didn't believe the story because I didn't believe that Arthur Lee Allen was the Zodiac Killer, but at the same time, they don't seem to come across as dishonest people. Now, purely on a superficial assessment, it's not like they're under some sort of magical truth serum. I mean, that's the answer to everything. He made the confession. It's just that he lied, because that's what sociopathic and narcissistic people do. Thank you to Midnight Adventures for the comment. And moving on to the next segment here on Black Box Online Radio, I was on Amazon.com just having a look at the book, So I See You Don't Paint Houses, by Jeremy Bertillon, and one of the titles that was recommended to me was called 55, The Zodiac Killer Identified, and it is by Tim Spencer, and this was a book that I hadn't heard of before, so I picked up a free sample from Kindle, or a free sample from Amazon for the Kindle. There, got it that time. And it says, Tim Spencer had been following the cold case of the late 1960s San Francisco area Zodiac killer since 2007. The Zodiac wrote to the press, challenging that his identity was hidden in his first cryptogram, but not his name. Over the years, the FBI and CIA's best computer attempts never found the answer. Neither had a world full of armchair detectives. And then, Spence found it, right where the killer said he had hidden it, and the killer was correct. The answer was easy. It only took him over 15 years and $100,000 to find it. His name was Edward Edwards. So yes, this book is called 55, The Zodiac Killer Identified, and it is going to be talking about Edward Wayne Edwards as a Zodiac Killer suspect. Ed Edwards is also the suspect of John Cameron, who has attributed an enormous amount of crimes to Ed Edwards. And when I pulled up the free sample from Kindle, the free sample from Amazon for Kindle about this book, 55, The Zodiac Killer Identified, most of it was talking about two different things. One was that who was the identity of the Zodiac Killer, and the next one was sort of, I mean, it's kind of part 1.5. The Zodiac Killer said that his identity is found in the ciphers, but not his name, and I'll get to that later. And the next one was talking about a crime that took place in Montana called the Kaczynski-Bogle murders. And as I said, John Cameron has attributed an enormous amount of crimes to Edward Wayne Edwards. 660 murders are actually attributed to this guy by John Cameron. What he says is that Ed Edwards committed 10 murders a year for 66 years on average, so he estimates that Ed Edwards committed 660 murders, and I was not familiar with all of them, and I just expected that there was going to be some type of connection to the Kaczynski-Bogle murders, and that's just what is shared in this free sample from Amazon. Got it right that time, about the book 55, Zodiac Killer Identified, and it's talking a lot about the Kaczynski-Bogle murders from Montana. Let's have a look, and let's see if there's anything new in that case. Going over to the Great Falls Tribune, this article is written by Tracy Rosenbaum, just citing the source, and I will get right to it. The Cascade County Sheriff's Office announced Tuesday that it has closed the file on the 1956 double homicide of Patricia Kaczynski and Lloyd Dwayne Bogle, resolving a 65-year-old cold case. Right. The perpetrator is, of course, going to be Ed Edwards, right? And Detective Sergeant John Kaner, who took the case over in 2012, said that it was the oldest case he could find nationwide to be solved using forensic genealogy. On January 3rd of 1956, 3 boys hiking along the Sun River near Wadsworth Park discovered Bogle, age 18, dead near his car. A day later, a county road worker found Kaczynski's body on the Vineyard Road north of Great Falls. Both had been shot in the head. Bogle's hands were bound behind his back with his own belt. His valuables and money were not stolen, and his car was on and in gear with the emergency brake deployed when his body was found. Kaczynski was born in Great Falls and was a junior at Great Falls High School when she was killed. Bogle was a Malmstrom Air Force Base airman from Waco, Texas. While stationed at Malmstrom, he became smitten with Kaczynski, according to Cadner. The two had even talked about marriage. Leads surfaced and dried up throughout the immediate investigation, and law enforcement had multiple suspects, even including the notorious gangster Whitey Bulger. Yes, he must have been flying that Cape Cod Airways. No, Cape Air actually is what it's called. And yes, that is a flight from Boston straight to Montana. At least they used to. I haven't been reading up on them too much lately. When now retired CCSO Detective Phil Matson started When the now-retired CCSO Detective Phil Matson started working in the evidence room in 1988, the Kaczynski-Bogle homicide evidence was there. In 2001, as a detective, Matson sent a microscope slide of a vaginal swab gathered from Kaczynski's body to the Montana State Crime Lab for analysis. The swab was a standard procedure in 1956. The lab found a sperm cell that did not belong to Bogle. This was just the process, and luckily, it was retained in evidence all of these years. Well, that should give us some hope in solving other cases about the preservation of DNA, or just giving some people some hope that these future that more and more cold cases will be solved in the future. As more time went by, about 35 suspects came and went. Law enforcement compared the sample to other men and then ruled them out. And I'm going to jump ahead in the article. The case broke when the 2018 arrest of Joseph James D'Angelo Jr., the Golden State Killer, was accomplished using forensic genealogy. In 2019, detectives coordinated with the biotechnology firm to perform additional testing on the DNA evidence on Kaczynski's body. They were able to upload the sample to voluntary genealogical databases, where they discovered a possible connection. Tracing the family's tree led to a suspect. And the suspect the man was identified as Kenneth Gould, not Ed Edwards. So I'm really not even sure what where the discussion is going to be going in this book 55 identified. No, it wasn't even Ed Edwards who committed this particular crime. And as I said, they have DNA evidence, and they seem pretty certain that his name was Kenneth Gould, different perpetrator altogether. And this guy committed the crime, and then he left the state of Montana and moved to Missouri, actually, and lived out his years there and ultimately passed away. And this article from the Great Falls Tribune doesn't say anything more about whether or not Kenneth Gould went on to become a serial killer, but when I was watching the documentary about the natural-born killers, and we're going to stick with that name, Dr. Michael Stone was talking about how some people, in fact, the majority of murderers are not serial killers. They commit a murder one time, and then they stop. And usually it's because of a particular type of reason why they're committing the crime. Maybe there's something involving an armed robbery. Maybe it's some thing where somebody murders their business partner to gain control of the business. Or how about the Forensic Files murder, as I call it? Every other episode of Forensic Files was talking about somebody getting murdered for life insurance. Not all murderers go on to become serial killers, and not too much information is shared about Kenneth Gould. And in all seriousness, you could see some similarities to the Zodiac killer in the crime that had been committed in the Kaczynski-Bogle murders, talking about how the male victim is tied up and bound with his hands behind his back, the way that the victims were tied up and bound at Lake Berryessa. I could comprehend how somebody, whether it's going to be Tim Spencer or John Cameron, is going to say that about Ed Edwards. And I've always said this from the very beginning about the Zodiac killer suspect Ed Edwards, is that he was a real serial killer who targeted lovers' lanes, going after couples in cars, and that's what the Zodiac killer did. I mean, forget Robert Christian Hansen. That's something that Edward Wayne Edwards actually did, and he went to jail for it. He's a convicted murderer. But I think that the activities of this individual, Kenneth Gould, whom I don't know an enormous amount about other than he committed a double homicide in the state of Montana in 1956, but this just goes to show you that there are lots of people who are doing this. These types of crimes are happening much more frequently than we had expected or that we thought, or that, I mean, talking about me specifically, that I had thought. And these types of murders happen because someone is going after men and women who are in vulnerable situations, in secluded areas, and it happens over and over again. And I mean, we could go through the list again, bring up the Phantom Killer, Texarkana, 1946, bring up the story of the Forest Phantom in Maryland in the 1980s, and I mean, just the countless stories. How about now? How about the Kaczynski-Bogle murders from Montana in 1956, when a couple is attacked in a car by an opportunistic predator, and these types of crimes just happen all the time. Look at the pre-Zodiac murders. Look at the murders of Robert Domingos and Linda Edwards. Look at the swindle murders of Johnny Ray and Joyce Swindle in 1964. I mean, these types of crimes are happening frequently. And even we get to the Rodriguez-Molina murders in 1967, another crime in California. People go after individuals in vulnerable situations in secluded areas, and they murder them. And it's just a sickening and disgusting and twisted aspect of humanity. But that is what's happening. And just because it seemed like a crime that this one serial killer would have committed, it doesn't mean that it's that particular serial killer. It could have been an isolated incident committed by a murderer on just committing one crime because he reached a breaking point and perhaps was overwhelmed with guilt. Maybe he never killed again, maybe he did. I'll look more into Kenneth Gould's case in the future, but it does not appear that there's any Zodiac killer connection to the Kaczynski-Bogle murders. But I mean, I still keep my eye out for the book 55, The Zodiac Killer Identified, because Tim Spencer's going to be talking about a lot more things that are Zodiac related, not just this one case. And as I said, from reading a sample of the book, it's really quite unclear how he's going to work that into his Zodiac theory, but it seems for all intents and purposes it's not Zodiac related. The next point relates to the Zodiac killer identity, right? So, now, Tim Spencer said something that is very profound. The Zodiac says that he has his identity in the ciphers, but not his name. Well, one person who would agree with you is Stefan Nyberg, who wrote the essay concerning the Exorcist letter, a layman's analysis, which I've discussed here on this channel. Stefan's also a very close follower of BlackBoxOnlineRadio, and he talked about this very clearly about solving that. What does that truly mean, that his identity is in the cipher but not his name? Stefan simply proposed that it's the Zodiac. Just that his identity is the Zodiac, and talking about killing people because it's so much fun, and slaves in paradise. He's just sharing the identity of the Zodiac killer, this persona that he has created, and all of the ciphers aren't going to reveal any type of legal name or any type of nickname that the person had other than the Zodiac, because that's his identity. Now, of course, I'm sure Tim Spencer is going to get into a much bigger discussion on this, but he is on thin ice already. Number one, proposing Edward Wayne Edwards as a Zodiac killer suspect, who is a rather weak suspect. I mean, maybe Tim Spencer just had a little bit of the Montana bug, and he wanted to really explore a suspect who had connections to Montana, and Edward Wayne Edwards was stationed in Deer Lodge, Montana. Stationed, no, he was imprisoned in Montana, not stationed, if you want to call it that. No, he was imprisoned there, and, I mean, not every crime was committed by Edward Wayne Edwards, and I know John Cameron doesn't want to hear that, but the murders of JonBenet Ramsey and Darlie Whittier's kids and the Black Dahlia, not all of these crimes were committed by Edward Wayne Edwards, and not even the Kaczynski Bogle murders were committed by Edward Wayne Edwards. This just goes to show you that there's a very dark side of human nature that is only truly being solved because of genealogical DNA testing. And John Lorden, who is the host of the Lord Nards program, was doing a show called Case Cracked for several years. It was written and produced by Christy Arnhart, and they worked on that show together, and they just simply said that they're talking about cases that have been cracked, cases that have been solved, mysteries that have been uncovered, and the solution has appeared. And how are cases always being solved these days? Genealogical DNA analysis. Forensic genealogy. That's what's solving cases, and they're like, we have to do the show in a different way now because everything is just associated with forensic genealogy. And this is good news. This is good news. That means that more and more cold cases are going to be solved. But my question to you guys is, we have just seen this cold case from Montana being solved, the Kaczynski Bogle murders, rest in peace to the victims. This is excellent news. But one day, will we see the Zodiac killer mystery being solved? Because the Zodiac killer didn't leave sperm samples behind the way that the Golden State Killer did, and the Golden State Killer left an enormous amount of DNA behind. He would leave in things like saliva DNA on things like beer cans that he would steal from people's fridges. I mean, beer bottles too. But the Zodiac may have simply gotten lucky because of the nature of the crimes that he committed. I mean, he's not making an enormous amount of physical contact with the victims. Sometimes, yes, most of the time, no. Instead, what he's doing is he is leaving very, very little evidence, and I think that it may have just simply been his method of operation that has prevented him from being caught. Choosing some secluded areas, not having a lot of physical contact with the victims, not having a lot of fingerprints left behind. The Zodiac was probably very, very careful not to leave a lot of fingerprints on things like the shell casings. I imagine him wearing lots of gloves. He was also probably very methodical when he's touching certain things like envelopes to not leave fingerprints, and I don't believe that they have the Zodiac killer's fingerprints on the outside of any envelope or stamp. That's just me. But one day, I hope we will be able to say that the Zodiac killer mystery has been solved.